It's been over 2 years since police officers who had a no-knock warrant for her boyfriend entered Breonna Taylor's home and shot and killed her. Since her death, demands for a criminal justice overhaul have come from all over, from massive protests in the streets to the powerful halls of Congress. However, mounting evidence suggests that there's more to the story than just a botched raid. Was police malpractice the root cause of Taylor's death, or did other factors, including gentrification, play a role? Friend of the show and host of Useful Idiots podcast on Substack, Katie Halper, joins us to discuss. Welcome back, Katie.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So what's going on here? What is this new information, and how does gentrification play a role?
So it's really an interesting story, and I understand that people are very excited about the recent news that a former detective involved in the shooting has pled guilty to falsifying a search warrant, and she's the first police officer to be convicted in relation to the raid, and she does face a potential sentence of up to 5 years, and it's, this is a step in the right direction, because before, the only officers who were charged with anything were acquitted. But I do think that, as you guys alluded to, there's a larger story here that's being ignored. And so one of the questions is, why were the officers falsifying a search warrant in the first place? And so if you look at reporting by the Louisville Courier-Journal, The Nation, a report by Root Cause Research Center, and statements by the Taylor family's lawyer, you'll see that the shooting was connected to a larger plan to gentrify the city, and I would say is political in origin, if not in intent. And so what happened is, since 2016, the mayor of Louisville has been promoting this multi-million-dollar development supposed to revitalize an area in which Taylor's ex-boyfriend, and that was the person they had the warrant around, Taylor's ex-boyfriend, DeMarcus Glover, was renting a house. And soon after this revitalization plan was launched, a special police squad called Place-Based Investigations was created to address, quote, systemically violent locations, including Glover's neighborhood. And lawyers for Breonna Taylor's family alleged in court documents filed in Jefferson Circuit Court that a police squad named Place-Based Investigations had, quote unquote, deliberately misled narcotics detectives to target a home on Elliott Avenue, leading them to believe they're after some of the city's largest violent crime and drug rings. And according to the complaint by Taylor's family lawyer, the home Glover rented was squarely in the middle of this planned redevelopment area. And the police sought 5 warrants the day that they sought the warrant on Breonna Taylor's house, and Glover was named in all 5 of them. And he'd been arrested twice for drug and gun charges. And after his second arrest following Taylor's death, the city moved to purchase the property on Elliott Avenue where he lived. And it was purchased for $1, and its listed market was like $17,000. So according to the lawyers, when the layers are peeled back, the origin of Breonna's home being raided by police starts with a political need to clear out a street for a large real estate development project, and finishes with a newly formed rogue police unit violating all levels of policy protocol and policing standards.
So this is so interesting of how different, I guess, ideological groups would phrase things. Like, you guys coming from the left would describe this as like gentrification. I would say this is akin to an eminent domain, right? A government policy trying to force people out of their homes to serve a private interest or a public-private interest, which we're utterly opposed to. So it's funny. So I think we probably all agree we would just frame it as slightly different ways.
That's a really interesting point, Robbie, because I do think that a lot of times, when we talked about this just in the segment with Alec Karat-Katsanis, that there are ways that a lot of the things we talk about in a criminal justice context are liberty concerns, or eminent domain concerns, or all these other kinds of things.
Or unaccountable government concerns.
Right. I mean, yes. And I think that sometimes...
What are our tax dollars being spent on?
The left
Abuse
can be a little... we can be a little rigid about how we describe things. But I just want to be really clear on what's being alleged here, Katie. The idea is that there was a targeting of this area, that more warrants were kind of issued for this area because there was an understanding that they needed to one, clean up the neighborhood for this broader development project, but also to put pressure on residents to go ahead and move out and make life as uncomfortable for them as possible, so that they can then get the property, so it's already inexpensive, devalued property, but to get it at even lower rates, nominal rates, $1 for an entire house.
Yeah, just to get these people to leave, basically, so they could tear them down, either clear out these people, rebuild new housing, whatever it was going to be, but to make this neighborhood a more revitalized one. I also have and of course, I mean, to be fair, not surprisingly, a spokeswoman for the mayor said the allegations are outrageous and without foundation or supporting facts. But I also looked at this report from Root Cause. Which does investigations on housing. And I'm going to quote this report. It says, Louisville's public nuisance ordinance has been in place for decades, but in October 2018, the Louisville nuisance ordinance was amended to expand the list of reasons a property could be considered a public nuisance. These reasons include misdemeanor crimes such as possession of drug paraphernalia, theft, and domestic violence. Around this same time, Louisville Metro government's Vision Russell initiative, which was the redevelopment initiative, leveraged funding from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development Choice Neighborhood Grant to increase surveillance in the Russell neighborhood. According to Ed Blaney, Louisville Metro Government Civic Technology Manager, this included the installation of at least 35 state-of-the-art surveillance cameras in 2019. This expanded police power in surveillance and nuisance abatement resulted in a sharp increase in public nuisance cases. So, and then they go on to say the increase in nuisance cases had direct correlations both in time and geography with land transfers for market rate development happening in the Russell neighborhood. Our analysis reveals that the forces of property and police converged in Russell to acquire the remaining property for the redevelopment of Elliott Avenue through the collaboration of the Louisville Metro Development, Louisville office, and the Louisville Metro Police Department, place-based investigation squad. Increased pressure from the Louisville mayor's office to acquire these properties led directly to the rapid employment of PBI. The PBI squad then employed a concept they were barely familiar with to create the false evidence needed for the no-knock warrant that led to the murder of Breonna Taylor. And I think one of the reasons that this is so important is not just to establish what really happened, but also if we want to respond to this with policy, I mean, we need to get rid of no-knock warrants, but that's not enough. We have to look at the way that gentrification is colliding with policing to create these failed situations and systemic surveillance. And, Eric Garner, interestingly enough, part of the reason he was killed was because there are luxury apartments near the park that he was around, that he would hang out around. And it was actually, officers began to closely monitor that area after a landlord made a 311 complaint regarding illegal drug and cigarette sales. So that was part of, his harassment by officers was part of this this cleanup initiative. And I also want to say that I know that it may sound like a conspiracy theory or an episode of The Wire, but there have been so many instances when people in marginalized communities point out systemic corruption and abuse, and they're kind of smeared or dismissed as conspiracy theorists. And then later on, they're vindicated once, like, the main character.
Well, and there's tons of examples of people being pushed out, of poor people being pushed out of their home. And look, I'm all about property rights. I do not think I would constrain the government from doing these kinds of things. What, Columbia University pushed people out in New York to make room for development. The original case that kicks off the whole eminent domain legal fight, Kelo versus New London, the infamous Kelo decision, that was about this woman who had this nice pink house she wanted to stay in, and the city wanted to bulldoze it so that Pfizer could have either a facility for housing for employees or something like that for Pfizer, for a private company, said, hey, we would like this ground. It was Pfizer. And she lost the case. It outraged everyone, but the Supreme Court said that was proper. And then even after this was all done, Pfizer said, you know what, we don't want to build there anyway.
Right. Well,
Outrageous.
speaking of Kelo, another dismissed conspiracy theory, speaking of Kelos, was, of course, the CIA trafficking drugs into inner cities, which was dismissed as a conspiracy theory. And we now know from now uncontested reporting from Gary Webb that was true. So that's just another example. Also, I highly recommend the film if we're talking about eminent domain, The Castle. It's an Australian film.
I'll check
Very
that
funny.
out.
Yeah. Not to end this on a funny note. We should end
It's
this
not
on a
funny.
serious note.
We can.
But we should. But the truth is, we should look at this because we know that the question is, why did this woman do this anyway? This police officer, Detective Goodlet. Why did she do it? When falsifying a warrant was already illegal when she did that, right? And she knew that, and that didn't stop her. So what were the incentives that made her do that? And we need to look at those. And I think that the incentives are things that are related to gentrification. And so if we want true justice, we have to include an analysis of gentrification in that.
Well, Katie Halper, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
We'll see you next week, and we'll have more Rising after this.